Hey guys, how you doing? We are going to dive into chapter 8, which is relationships in ecosystems. Now, the majority of this chapter looks at what ecosystems are, the different components in ecosystems, and how they interact. So we're now looking at a branch of biology called ecology, which is the study of ecosystems and the interactions between animals, plants, organisms, and their environment. Okay, so I'm going to break this chapter up into a series of short videos. So hopefully that'll make it easy for you guys to be able to look at this in your own time and follow it along. And hopefully that'll be helpful for your learning. Okay. All right, so here's the first part. We're going to take a look at what an ecosystem is, and we're going to introduce you guys to the biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem. So we define an ecosystem as a community of organisms that interact with their surrounding environment at a particular time. And there are a few keywords in there. So when we look at ecosystems, the term is very loosely used to basically categorize any sort of environment in which animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, any sort of organisms live together. And so your kind of keywords here is community, organisms, environment, and time. Yeah. So the first part, the community part, is the living component of an ecosystem. So for an ecosystem to be an ecosystem, there needs to be different groups of living things that are together. Okay. It also has a non-living component, which is the surrounding environment. Yeah. And the environment is the kind of the place in which those organisms live. And interact with one another, which is the third main thing, is that ecosystems are not only defined by organisms and they're in a particular environment, but interacting with each other and their environment as well. And the last part is that it always sits at a particular time frame. And that's a very loose term as well, because time can be measured in days to months to years. Okay. Ecosystems generally vary in size, but obviously it needs to be large enough to be able to permit those interactions to actually occur between the organisms in that location. Yeah? And so, as I mentioned before, ecology is simply the study of the interactions between the organisms and their environment. Okay. Now, if we look at understanding terminology, so from the smallest kind of area in biology to the largest kind of area, microbiology deals with cells and things like that. And then you've kind of got, as you go larger, you kind of got the cells, and then the organism, and then which forms the species. And from the species, you get the population, which is simply a group of the same organisms that live in the same area. So in this example here, our organism is the rabbit, and a population will be a group of rabbits that live in the same area. Now, the word community in biology is used to define multiple populations of different species living together. So in our little kind of picture here, you've got the community being the rabbits, the birds, and also the grass and the flower here. Now this is an animated diagram, so I don't know how accurate it is, but there are 3 sets of populations in this particular community. Right? And then the ecosystem is all of those particular populations then interacting with their environment. Yeah? And so for it to be an ecosystem, it needs to have those communities of different species together and then interacting with them. Okay? And then all of these things are confined to a particular time frame. Yeah? So that's just some terminology to get out of the way. So when you hear the word, a population of zebra on the African savanna, or a population of bacteria growing on a particular, like moldy bread or something like that, then it's referring to a particular species or a group of the same organisms. But when you hear words like a community of organisms, it is referring to different species that are living together. Okay. The term we use to sort of understand variety and diversity in ecosystems is called biodiversity, and that's one of the key features of a lot of ecosystems. We talk about biodiversity because it helps us understand the importance of different organisms being in that particular habitat or particular environment. So the biodiversity, sorry, is simply the variety of organisms in that ecosystems, and we measure it two ways. Yeah, so we look at the number of different species that occupy that one ecosystem. So we call that species richness. So ecosystems with a high species richness will be places that have lots and lots of different species living together. These are your rainforests, these are your coral reefs, which have incredible species richness, in fact some of the highest in the world. And we also measure biodiversity by species abundance, which is actually the number of individuals in that species, right? And so in general, there are different places will vary between richness and abundance. Some places will have lots and lots of different species, but in terms of the actual number of individual in each species, it might not be that high. And so those places generally have favorable conditions in which species richness is high, so there's a lot of variation, but in terms of the actual numbers of each individual, it's not as high. Okay, so the example below here is just a rainforest. So rainforests are really well known for having the highest species richness in the world, so you've got different varieties of plants and animals. You've got ferns, you've got trees, you've got vines, you've got birds, and different species of insects. However, if you look at the population of each of those species, it is relatively low, and there are reasons for that. If you look, these favorable conditions means that there's a lot of competition between the organisms. I mean, they have to fight a lot for their survival and the resources that's available to them. And because the conditions are favorable, they all do really well, and so it keeps the number of, or the abundance, really low, but there's a lot of variety in them. Okay. On the kind of flip side, when you have harsh conditions, you generally find that the species richness is lower because it's a lot more difficult for different species to survive. But then we also then see that those who do survive have that competitive advantage because they have some sort of adaptation which allows them to survive better in their environment. And so those places have a high abundance but a low species richness. So your deserts, you can sort of see in this image here that there's a lot of kind of tough grasses in this particular desert, but there's not a whole lot of other things. And so the grasses here have a high abundance because they have the adaptations to survive in that particular environment, and they've sort of capitalized on that really well. Okay. And if you look at the globe and the environments around the globe, a lot of ecosystems are dependent on two particular factors, which are kind of like your overarching factors. The first is the physical environment that the community lives in, and the second is simply the latitude or distance from the equator. In general, there are patterns in ecosystems. You can sort of see there, this graph here, this image here shows the relative richness of species all around the globe. And you can see the general trend that as you sort of move further away from the equator, the species richness decreases. And the reason for that is at the equator, the conditions are very favorable. It's tropical, there's high rainfall, high sunlight, and it drives a lot of plants, plant growth. And so you have rainforests and environments where plants can do really well. And when plants do really well, generally animals and other organisms do really well as well. And then as we sort of move towards the poles, the conditions get harsher, the weathers get colder, and so there is a lower species richness up in those areas. Other things include deserts, so you can sort of see there in the African, the Sahara Desert just above Central Africa, the conditions are really harsh, and down in Australia as well, the conditions are really harsh, and then up at the poles, up in Greenland and northern Canada, where it snows pretty much all time of the year, conditions there are also really harsh, and so you've got a very, very low species richness, but those places would have a high abundance of the organisms that do survive. Ecosystems can vary. I mean, they can be anything from the size of an entire rainforest to even your backyard would count as an ecosystem. But in general, we like to just classify them in different ways according to some of the key characteristics. Yeah. So you've got rainforest, which kind of your more well-known ones. You've got forests, desert, grassland, which is kind of characterized by like large amounts of grass, and they're kind of your main primary production there. Tundra, which is actually snow. Freshwater, rivers, lakes, all those particular environments are freshwater ecosystems. You also have a particular area called the intertidal, which is what we are going to look at in more detail when we do our field trip up to Queenscliff. And we're going to be investigating the intertidal zone in particular, which is basically where the land meets the sea and the changing in tides there. You also have shallow seas and open oceans representing kind of your marine ecosystems. And they're the largest ecosystems because most of the world is made up of the ocean. Now, we're going to go through one example and sort of just analyze some of the different components in an ecosystem. Every ecosystem is composed of two parts. Yeah, we've got what we call the abiotic component. Abiotic simply means non-living, and so that is part of the ecosystem that is non-living. So in our image here, in our rainforest ecosystem, that would be the rocks, the ground, the soil, the water, the sunlight, and all of those kind of factors that play an important role in the ecosystems, but they are non-living. Okay, and then you have the second component, which is the biotic component. These are the living things. So all of the organisms in this particular ecosystem make up the biotic components. And so it's the interaction between the abiotic and the biotic components that actually define those characteristics in our ecosystems. And so in the rainforest ecosystem, you could say that the interaction between the plants and the sunlight defines rainforest as being a place which have a high rates of growth because the plants capitalize on the high sunlight and high rainfall, and they grow at a really, really fast rate. That is an interaction between plants and the rainfall that they get and the water. Another interaction you could say could be how the animals then use their environment to hide or to hunt or to live and to create nests and things like that. And so each of those kind of interactions vary between ecosystems. You're not going to see the same interactions in a rainforest ecosystem as you would in, say, a intertidal ecosystem, because those interactions are completely different. You have a different physical environment, and you've also got different sets of living organisms that interact there. And so these characteristics is what gives it that kind of diversity and that kind of unique nature that you often find in those ecosystems. Okay, so that's just a bit of a brief overview. What I would encourage you guys to do is, as you investigate and look at example ecosystems, to actually analyze what the abiotic components of those ecosystems are, and also the living and the biotic components, and then identify what are those interactions that make those particular ecosystems unique. And so it's a really fascinating area of biology, and it's particularly an area that I'm interested in. And I would encourage you guys, as we sort of explore this chapter, to always be asking those kind of key questions. What are these interactions between the organism and the environment which define this particular location? Okay. So next lesson, we're going to look at how organisms actually interact within their ecosystem, and we're going to look at different types of relationships that organisms have with one another. Okay. All right. Ciao.